Picture this for a moment. It's a Friday morning in October 2022. The sun has barely climbed over the Florida coast. The air is thick with that salty Atlantic breeze that anyone who has visited Cape Canaveral knows by heart. Seagulls drift overhead. Tourists press their faces against fences miles away from the launch pad, squinting through cheap binoculars they bought at gas stations the night before. At exactly 10:19 a.m., the ground starts to tremble. A massive white rocket roars off the pad at Kennedy Space Center. 3 boosters strapped together, 27 engines firing at once. The sound doesn't reach the spectators right away. Light travels faster than thunder. So first they see the fire, bright, blinding, a second sun, then the noise hits, it punches you in the chest. It rattles car windows 10 miles away. Children cover their ears. Grown adults laugh and cry at the same time. Some just stand there frozen, watching humanity's dreams claw their way out of Earth's gravity. On top of that rocket sits a spacecraft about the size of a tennis court. Inside its delicate frame are instruments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Magnetometers, spectrometers, cameras. Tools designed to study something no human eye has ever seen up close. Its destination, a strange, lonely chunk of metal floating 2.2 billion miles away in the cold blackness between Mars and Jupiter. The journey will take nearly 6 years. The spacecraft won't arrive until July 2029. By then, Bobbies born today will be in school, wars will have ended, new leaders will have risen, whole chapters of human life will have closed, but the little spacecraft will just keep flying. Silent, patient, steady. The mission is called Psyche. The target is an asteroid believed to be packed with metal unlike almost anything else in our solar system. Scientists think it might be the exposed core of a dead planet, a window into what lies deep inside worlds like our own. Maybe even Earth itself. NASA poured roughly $1.2 billion into the entire project. But here's the part nobody saw coming 15 years ago. The rocket carrying this priceless mission wasn't built by NASA, it was built by a private company. A company that not too long ago people laughed at. A company whose rockets used to explode on the pad and tumble into the ocean. A company that the government once dismissed as a hobby for a rich dreamer. And NASA only paid $131 million to launch the entire mission. That single fact tells a much bigger story. A story about pride, about broken promises, about billions of taxpayer dollars vanishing into bureaucracy, and about one man who years later quietly admitted he had been wrong all along. Let me take you back to 2010. The world was different then. Smartphones were still new. Social media barely mattered in politics. And space, real space, was something most people thought belonged only to government agencies. Back then, NASA was dreaming big. Lawmakers in Washington had just handed the agency a mission. Build a giant new rocket, bigger than anything since the Saturn V that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. They called it the Space Launch System, SLS for short. It was supposed to be the largest, most powerful rocket ever made by human hands. They said it would be cheap. They said it would be quick. They promised the public that this rocket would be built from leftover space shuttle parts sitting in warehouses across the country. Engines already tested, boosters already proven, just bolt them together, they said. Simple, it would launch by 2017, they said. At the same time, on the other side of the country in California, a young company called SpaceX was struggling to survive. Its rockets kept blowing up. Its founder was burning through his fortune trying to keep the lights on. Most engineers in the industry quietly chuckled at the idea that a Silicon Valley outsider could ever build something as massive as what NASA was attempting. 2 senators led the charge for SLS in Washington. Bill Nelson from Florida, a former astronaut himself, proud. Connected, a man who believed deeply in government-led space exploration. Kay Bailey Hutchison from Texas, strong, influential, a defender of jobs in her state. Soon Richard Shelby from Alabama joined them, another powerful voice, another believer. Together they made 2 bets with taxpayer money. 2 bets that would shape American spaceflight for the next decade. First bet, SpaceX would fail. Second bet, big traditional companies like Boeing would build the future of space travel. Both bets lost. Spectacularly, in 2014, NASA's administrator at the time was a man named Charlie Bolden. He was a former Marine, a former astronaut, a man who had flown the space shuttle 4 times. He carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had seen Earth from above and lived to talk about it. That year he stood in front of cameras and said something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He looked into the lens. His voice was steady. And he said, in essence, that America didn't have any commercial heavy-lift rocket. He brushed off the Falcon Heavy as something that may someday come about. It was just a drawing on a board, he said. A fantasy, a PowerPoint slide. SLS was real, he insisted. You could see the confidence on his face, the certainty, the decades of government experience telling him that private companies didn't build serious rockets. They never had, they never would. 2 years later, in 2016, he doubled down. He told reporters he wasn't a fan of private investment in heavy-lift vehicles. He believed NASA's responsibility to the nation was to handle the things normal people couldn't do or wouldn't want to do. Big rockets, he said, belonged in government hands. His words spread across the space community. Some nodded along, others quietly disagreed. Then 2018 happened. On a sunny February afternoon, SpaceX launched the Falcon Heavy for the first time. 27 engines lit up at once. The ground shook, the sky filled with white smoke. And then in a moment that broke the internet, two of the boosters returned to Earth and landed side by side on twin pads at Cape Canaveral. They landed vertically in sync, like something out of a science fiction movie from the 1950s. People watching on YouTube screamed, cried, cheered. The video clip would be replayed millions of times in the years that followed. Meanwhile, NASA's SLS was still in pieces, still delayed, still over budget, still years away from flying when SLS finally lifted off in late 2022, 4 years after Falcon Heavy proved itself. The celebration was real. Engineers had worked their hearts out. The launch was beautiful. The rocket performed exactly as promised. But that single SLS launch cost taxpayers around $23.8 billion when you added everything up. $23 billion for one launch. Read that number again. Let it sink in. That's enough money to fund entire universities for decades, to build hospitals, to launch hundreds of smaller missions, all spent on one rocket that flies once and falls into the ocean. In 2020, something interesting happened. Charlie Bolden sat down for an interview with a political news outlet. By now, he was no longer running NASA. He had retired. He didn't have to defend budgets. He didn't have to face angry congressional hearings. He didn't have to please senators with billions of dollars flowing into their home states. He was free. A reporter asked him what might happen to SLS in the next 4 years. His answer surprised people. He said SLS would eventually go away. He said private companies were going to catch up. He said they would build heavy rockets and fly them for far less money than NASA could ever manage. That's just the way it works, he said, just like that. The same man who once dismissed Falcon Heavy as a drawing on paper now admitted, openly and on the record, that the private rocket had won. That the future belonged to companies, not government programs. It was a quiet confession. No apology, no grand reversal. Just a man who had seen the truth and could finally speak it without losing his job. Here's where things get painful if you're an American taxpayer. NASA spends about $3 billion every single year just to develop SLS and keep the ground systems running at Kennedy Space Center. Every year, like clockwork, whether the rocket flies or not. The rocket was supposed to launch in 2017. It didn't fly until 2022. That 5-year delay alone cost something close to $12 billion, maybe more. Nobody really knows the full number. Now imagine, just for a moment, if NASA had spent that same delay money on Falcon Heavy launches instead. You could buy around 110 reusable Falcon Heavy launches with $1 billion, or 67 expendable versions of the rocket. Together, that adds up to roughly 3,800 tons of lifting capacity into space. 3,800 tons. That's enough to build 10 international space stations, or a serious moon base with room for dozens of astronauts, or send dozens of probes to every interesting moon, asteroid, and planet in our solar system. The math is brutal. And here's the part that really stings. NASA didn't pay a single dollar to develop Falcon Heavy, not 1 cent. SpaceX built the entire rocket with private money, investors, customer contracts, the dreams of engineers working late nights in California. In fact, NASA actually saves about $1 million a year because SpaceX rents the old Launch Complex 39A from them. The same historic pad that once sent Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. SpaceX maintains it now. NASA pockets the rent. Think about that for a moment. The government once feared private companies would never build serious rockets. Today, a private company pays the government rent to use its old launch pad. A pad that would otherwise sit empty, slowly rusting in the salt air. Lori Garver served as NASA's deputy administrator from 2009 to 2013. She was there in the early days. She watched the SLS program take shape. She knew the engineers, she knew the senators, she knew the contractors, she saw the decisions being made behind closed doors. And she didn't agree with most of them. She called the situation a travesty, a word she chose carefully, not mistake, not shame, travesty, a betrayal of what NASA was supposed to stand for. She said every dollar wasted on SLS was a dollar that could have funded real science. Real missions, real landers, real telescopes, real exploration, things that actually get humans and machines somewhere new in the universe. Instead, the money keeps flowing into a rocket that newer, cheaper, smarter machines have already left behind in the dust. Her words sting because they're true. There's an old saying that most of us heard from our grandparents. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Back in 2010, Congress counted theirs. They were sure SpaceX would fail. They were sure Boeing would dominate the future. They built an entire multi-decade program around those assumptions. They locked in budgets. They wrote laws. They handed contracts to old friends in big companies. Today the chickens have hatched. And they're not the ones anyone in Washington expected. That bright Friday morning launch in October 2022 wasn't just about an asteroid mission. It wasn't just about science. It was a quiet message written in fire and smoke across the blue Florida sky. A message anyone watching could read if they paid attention. The future of space doesn't belong to the rocket that costs billions per flight and falls into the ocean. It belongs to the one that lands itself, flies again, and does the job for a fraction of the price. NASA scientists watching that Falcon Heavy climb into the morning sky knew it. The numbers knew it. History will know it too. Sometimes the biggest revolutions don't come from the loudest voices in the room. They don't come from the people with the biggest titles or the deepest connections in Washington. They come from the quiet ones who keep building, even when nobody believes they can, even when everyone laughs, even when the explosions keep happening and the money keeps running out. They just keep going. Until one day the world looks up, sees the rocket climb, hears the thunder roll across the coast, and finally understands what was happening all along. The future arrived quietly on schedule while the experts were still arguing.